Welcome to this webinar presented by the Financial Mail on Open Secrets, entitled, rather auspiciously, Wanted, the State Capture Conspiracists. Thank you to so many of you for joining us today. I assume that you are probably the last 300 people who might have electricity in this country, so thank you for using it to be on this call and to listen to us and hopefully get some great insights from the Open Secrets team about state capture in the wake of the Zondo report. Our two guests are Michael Marchand, Head of Investigations at Open Secrets, who's done a number of webinars with us before, and they've all been fantastic. And joining us as well, Raisa Partha. Guys, welcome. It's great to have you on this call. Perhaps, Michael, I can start with you just up front. You know, this is quite an auspicious week. The fact, leave aside the fact that 6 of us have electricity, but in terms of the Zondo report coming out, you released your report at the same time, and it was a bit of a coincidence. Could you give us perhaps just an overview of how your report came about and what you were trying to achieve with it, just as a sort of a brief overview?
Absolutely, I'm happy to do so, and thanks very much, Rob, and to the FM team for having us again for this launch. And look, as you've said, it's an auspicious or inauspicious week, but I think it's also quite helpful in a sense that the final report of the Zondo Commission being released at the same time that so many of us are plunged into darkness, because those things are deeply linked. And one of the things that we will be speaking about in this webinar and in this report is how that extends to so many different parts of South Africa's society. The fact that we don't have a functioning train service because of what's happened at PRASA, for example, the fact that we are in chronic load shedding, that water infrastructure and other things have been hit so hard is a direct result of state capture. But as you say, Open Secrets has been doing work on state capture for a number of years now. And maybe that's, for those listening, that's maybe a helpful way into how this report came about, is that we'd done work for a number of years. We made a big submission to the Zondo Commission in February of 2020, where we asked the Commission to look very specifically at the private actors that are implicated in state capture. And some of those actors recur in this report, looking at the banks and the audit firms and consultants that were really at the heart of so many of the big state capture cases. And that report, maybe unsurprisingly, focused on the big SOEs, the kind of big ticket items, places like Eskom and Transnet, which were the sites of such massive extraction in terms of the total amounts of money lost to state capture. But coming out of that report and over the last kind of 18 months, what we started to ask ourselves internally, well, what about all of the other, sometimes forgotten about sites of state capture and corruption over the last few years that maybe are not the major focus of a lot of our ongoing discussions, but were the sites of rampant criminality? And most important emerging from that, and Raisa maybe could speak to this a little bit better, but more specifically, who are the individuals that we can directly identify in those cases to be held to account through criminal and other means? And that's what's taken us to this report, Wanted, the State Capture Conspirators, where we have identified individuals in terms of 4 case studies. We look at the Passenger Rail Agency, PRASA, SARS, the Revenue Service, Denel, and South African Airways. And we specifically say these are the people that we believe the Hawks, the Prosecuting Authority, and other regulatory bodies and various professional bodies, they could act on now, put this out, and then use it as well. And this is something that we can discuss, but also use it now as a litmus test for law enforcement going forward to say the Commission and a range of other sources have provided us with the evidence. We need now an answer as to why these cases are not being moved on.
That's a very brief overview of what is a fantastically comprehensive report. But I suppose, Michael, before we get into it, and Raisa, I was going to ask you about one of the case studies in a second, but just, Michael, your thoughts overall from the Zondo report that was released last week. I mean, it's a massive document, and it's been exhaustively exhumed in the media over the past week. Do you feel that it achieved what we actually wanted 4 years ago? I mean, that's just a massive question, but I mean, was it worth it? What were your thoughts on it?
So I think, from the Open Secrets perspective, maybe as a starting point to say that commissions of inquiry have a very patchy record in South Africa. Many of them have been deeply disappointing. And I think it's very important to acknowledge from the get-go that there's no sense in this regard that the Zondo Commission kind of skirted its desire to engage in the material. It did an extraordinary amount of work. It detailed or dealt with millions of pages of evidence, thousands of witnesses. And I think that despite quite significant gaps, and some of those gaps, again, refer to those private sector actors, particularly the banks and other professional firms that we feel were maybe treated with kid gloves or quite softly by the Commission at various points. I think for us, where we can say it is worth it is that the Zondo Commission, after those years, has completely vindicated the work of whistleblowers and investigative journalists. And perhaps most importantly, the Zondo Commission has come out and said, again, these are the individuals that you can and should act on. And that's not always the case, again, with the Commission of Inquiry. Sometimes they can come out and skirt the issues, and in the worst case scenario, deliberately try and bury issues. And I think one of the things we could speak about a little bit further, but if we talk about the amount of money that was spent, for example, on the Zondo Commission, but it also provides us with extraordinary possibilities to prosecute. And if those prosecutions and other actions were taken forward appropriately, also provides us opportunity for asset recovery to get a lot of the money back. And it's provided, I think, an extraordinary amount of forensic material now that can be used both by us and civil society. And to be clear, we've relied on the Commission's work very heavily in our own report, but also clearly to law enforcement who have had access to the work of the Commission over a number of years. And so, although, as you said, it's a very big question, I think our overall takeaway is that despite quite significant gaps and problems we have with the Commission, at the very least, it provides us with significant opportunities going forward. And maybe the biggest opportunity it provides is an agenda for prosecution accountability that we can use to disrupt networks of capture that have been operating for so long and have really paralyzed and destroyed so many of our state institutions.
An agenda for accountability is exactly what it is, but I think it could be quite frustrating to many people that after 4 years, we're only at this point right now, as opposed to actually putting people in jail. But we'll get to that in a second. Raisa, can I ask, just in terms of, let's take one example from the report, I mean, which is fantastically comprehensive, and I do think everyone should go and download it and read it, go through it. And as well, I think what you can also do in this particular webinar is pose questions to us, and we ask the very smart people who wrote the report to answer them for us. So please do post your questions in the chat. But just Raisa, take one example, PRASA, Passenger Rail Agency. I mean, this is an institution that should have provided sort of basically greased the economy for people to actually work and for people to live in society and make it a functional state. And it was completely captured and taken apart through the last 10 years. Perhaps you could give us an overview of your thoughts and your report into PRASA specifically, and what your findings were and what you recommend in the end of it, because I mean that's ultimately what's important.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob. So PRASA is obviously a big one for us. We investigated 4 state agencies and entities, PRASA, Denel, SAA, and SARS. And I think particularly with the release of the last Zondo Commission report, PRASA has really begun to even have more traction in public conversation. And I think one of the key things to take away from the report, the Zondo Commission report, for example, is that the Commission recommended that there be a commission of inquiry, a separate commission of inquiry into corruption at PRASA. This is something that we kind of differ on in our recommendations. We suggest that there should be prosecutions, that there should be sort of interventions by professional and regulatory bodies. So when we look at PRASA, for example, just one contract, the Swifambo contract, which is famously known as the Tall Trains contract, this is where PRASA paid 2.7 billion rand for trains that didn't even fit the railways of South African rail lines. This is just one example that we look at in the report, and we identify the people who were implicated in this contract, like Oswald Mashaba, who started Swifambo Rail Leasing, Fostu AG, who was the company that partnered with Swifambo. And we must remember that there have been numerous investigations that have been done. PRASA itself has done internal investigations. There was a Horwath report that investigated money flows and how money from the rail agency went directly to people like Mashaba, went directly to people like Montana, and was used to purchase homes, for example, and luxury villas. And so what we're suggesting is that people like Montana and like Oswald Moshaba must be prosecuted for their role in these crimes. And we're also saying that these assets need to be recovered. This is important work in order for PRASA, for example, if they could recover these assets, they could perhaps go somewhere to repairing the devastating implications of state capture on trains that we've seen today.
You talk about how there have been plenty of investigations and forensic investigations over the years into what happened here. We knew about the tall trains many years ago. So why has it taken so long? I mean, in your report, you specifically run through the methodology of how it could actually happen. Why are you the only guys doing this? Why have our law enforcement authorities sat around and waited so long? I mean, surely this is, the notion of justice delayed is justice denied.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the argument we make. It's also important to consider that when you look at a case like PRASA, which has been ongoing for so long, people do begin to lose hope. And what we're trying to show is that there is hope, that these guys are known, there have been investigations done, and it is possible to take action. And I think, that we're not the only ones who have been doing this type of work. NGO in Cape Town, Unite Behind, has also been doing extensive work investigating corruption at PRASA, and Ground Up, the local news outlet, has also reported extensively on corruption at PRASA. In our next report, which will be released in August, we go into some of the reasons why law enforcement agencies have failed to investigate PRASA, and a lot of that is to do with appointments that have been made in the Hawks. Appointments that haven't lived up to what they are meant to do in terms of promising accountability and a police service that acts in the interest of South Africa.
Michael, I mean, you just to give a brief overview of some of the others, I mean, SAA is an example of, you had a board that was completely unaccountable and insane, crazy decisions that could never have been seen to be in the interest of the country. Is it the same there with those cases? I mean, VR Laser and Denel was so incredibly blatant. I mean, you agree with Raisa? I mean, any more thoughts and insights on why the law enforcement authorities haven't done what you've done here beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Raisa, particularly in the sense that our understanding is that the problems at law enforcement in particular are kind of twofold. The one is a structural problem, is that systemically there appears to be a lack of skills and a lack of structure that allows the organization to pull in the right direction. And those kind of systemic and structural problems are then amplified by the fact that you have people in very powerful positions within the Hawks and the MPA who have been appointed, who are political appointees, who appear to have deliberately obstructed cases linked to state capture, but who in other cases have vehemently pursued cases that don't appear to be, that don't appear to have any merit. But, Rob, to go back to your question, particularly about South African Airways, because I think it's a very interesting example. One of the things we tried to do in this report is say, yes, prosecutions and accountability is absolutely key. But in addition to that, there are a range of other ways and a range of other actors that you can hold accountable in different ways. And South African Airways is a great example of that, is that we believe that Dudu Myeni should be criminally prosecuted for her conduct at South African Airways. But Outer's successful application to have her declared a delinquent director for life is also an incredibly powerful tool. And it's something that applies to the Denel case equally, is that while we're looking at criminal prosecutions, and this takes us back to the state-owned enterprises themselves, they have a duty to act on what they now know, and they are actually best placed, the SOEs themselves, to bring delinquency applications to the directors who have wrought such damage on them over a number of years. And that can have a very significant impact on those individuals who no doubt want to hold directorships in the future. And so that's one route. In the case of South African Airways, something that Open Secrets has written about before and is included quite in detail again in this report, is the role of PwC and Nkonki as the auditors of South African Airways. And that is one example where I think the Zondo Commission has really added to our understanding of what happened at SAA, got the PwC auditors on the stand, and really forced them eventually to concede that there were reportable irregularities at South African Airways that they failed to declare to the regulator. And that it's another area where both we think that the regulatory body as the IRBA should revisit those cases and say, well, actually, have we taken sufficient action against the professionals who were implicated? But also potentially with the auditors, and various directors is, did their conduct amount to criminal action in various ways? And so it's another, I suppose, part of the story we're trying to tell here is that while we battle to rebuild our criminal justice agencies, we're also calling on those range of other bodies that they can contribute as well to accountability for the network of individuals that were involved in these kinds of cases.
Dudumieni is an obvious one, as you mentioned. Jacob Zuma in these cases, I mean, it's ultimately you could say, a mastermind to some extent, if you would ever call Jacob Zuma a mastermind of anything. Prosecution for him and state capture?
I mean, so in terms of, okay. I'll go ahead. In terms of what we've done, so we've tried to really identify what we call the low-hanging fruits, which are the sort of cases that can be prosecuted. And as we know, prosecuting Jacob Zuma is incredibly difficult. The one way which we can identify in terms of these cases where Jacob Zuma could be held to account is for his conduct at SARS. So what we argue there is that, we know in a certain period of 4 or 6 years, Zuma met directly with Bain consulting firm 18 times. And we're saying, was that right? Should he not be investigated, for example, for contravening the Public Service Act, which talks about the way in which public servants must behave in their professional conduct? So that is one way of identifying Jacob Zuma's role in some of the entities that we've identified. But ultimately, the aim of this report isn't just to look at the big politicians, it's to look at the private entities, the auditors, like Michael said, at Nkonki and PwC, the names that we also don't know, and to identify those networks.
And I think you're right that the low-hanging fruit is an easier and faster and more efficient way to start at the bottom and proceed up to the top to some extent. And I do think that would deal with, to an extent, with the degree of frustration that the society feels about the lack of progress on this. And I just want to come back to something you said, Raisa, about the Raymond Zondo's suggestion of another inquiry into PRASA. I mean, Henny van Veeren from Open Secrets has written a lot about the arms deal inquiry, and you're right, Michael. I mean, inquiries have a pretty patchy history. Do we need another inquiry? Surely we've listened to one for 4 years. I mean, that's completely, is it not just kicking the can further and further down the road till we can't even see the actual perpetrators anymore? Perhaps, Michael, if you could take this one, since I failed to address the previous one to Raisa properly.
Sorry, no, absolutely. I mean, I think we are definitely of the opinion that another commission of inquiry with regards to a case like PRASA just doesn't make any sense. And I think that this is another thing, is that we shouldn't, what it almost allows us to do and allows the public narrative to be shaped around, there's so much that we still don't know. And we just don't think that's true at this point. There's an extraordinary amount of information now that's in the public domain. And maybe to return to something that Raisa said earlier, because I think it's perhaps one of the most powerful parts of the PRASA story to me, is that in our investigation, the way that we traced some of the assets that were acquired via the loot of corruption at PRASA was through this Horwath forensic report that Raisa referenced earlier. And the extraordinary thing is that that report was commissioned by the Hawks. It was commissioned by law enforcement to allow them to undertake an investigation and potentially a prosecution. And we are now in this case where we essentially are going to go back to the Hawks. We're going to go back to Parliament. We're going to give them this report and say, you should prosecute. And if you're wondering what the source of the information is, it's the report that you commissioned or the information that was made available to you by another organization 6 or 7 years ago. And I think that's why it's so important to say, look, let's draw a line under what has come out of the Zondo Commission. It now goes to the MPA, to other bodies, and they must now act on it and also begin explaining to us what the delays are in any of the cases that are brought. One of the points that we are increasingly speaking about within Open Secrets is the fact that we are beginning to see lots of state capture arrests. And this objectively appears to be a great thing, but then we hear silence. And so that is often the next question, is it's not enough simply to have a moment of kind of, a kind of public coup where we have a big arrest, but then the MPA don't appear to be able to take the case forward in court.
So, I mean, you've talked as well about the gaps in the Zondo report, and there's a situation where you can't look at everything. And there have been some of the questions already posted about, for example, at SA Airways Technical, Nonsasa Mamela, and why she was not, why your report does not call for the prosecution of her, for example, for the millions that went missing. I mean, is it a sense that, there are some low-hanging fruit and you've chosen the ones that are the easiest to get done and roll up from there? I mean, there are many people who could be held accountable right throughout, and I'm sure you haven't identified all of them. I mean, how did you select the people you decided to go for? Raisa, perhaps if you could answer that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm glad that, there's enough information out there that people can also see the gaps in what we've done, and that it has been kind of selective. It just goes to show how much has been reported on state capture. So in terms of the process of how we selected our cases, we try to pick the cases that we knew the NPA and the Hawks and other professional bodies were not acting on. And our role in this was to kind of apply pressure and to highlight these cases to show, hey, we know about Eskom and Transnet, those are massive and they need to be acted on urgently. But there's also these cases which might be a little bit faster and a little bit more effective to prosecute and to investigate in order to get us some form of accountability so that we can finally work towards preventing corruption. Because at the moment, there is a high level of recidivism for corruption crimes. There's a repetition of it, and it's because we don't have that accountability that we need.
Michael, you would agree with that assessment? I mean, some of the questions have asked, for example, about Zuma and Jack, and there's so many cases that Zondo didn't even get to. And I think what he said when he presented the report is, if we were to go through everything, we would still be doing this in 10 years' time, and you have to draw the line in the sand that Raisa just mentioned.
Absolutely. And there's also a completely practical perspective from our side, is that already Raisa, you could correct me, but I believe at kind of 45,000 words from our point of view, we just as authors also start to worry about people's capacity to read that. And the Zondo Commission is a great example. I think it was 5,500 words, the final reports in totality. And obviously, from law enforcement's perspective, that is your only job. So you need to be able to read that. And so practically, there's some of the cases that, we looked at. The other thing that I would go back to, just to reiterate, is that what we tried to do in this report is provide an interesting cross-section of actors that we think are responsible for state capture. And there's maybe a deeper point underlying here that kind of goes to the heart of it, is that the Zondo Commission in its kind of unpacking of state capture, and this is one of the critiques that I think lots of analysts and members of the public have laid at the feet of the commission, is that when you read the final report, we are left with a bit of a gap of what Judge Zondo understood state capture to be, right? There wasn't the executive summary, for example, that was promised. And there wasn't really, I would argue, a well laid out case for a fundamental understanding of what state capture was. But if we take a step back and look at what the commission decided to focus on, and particularly the majority of its analysis, what you start to see, I think, is an understanding is that this is a public procurement problem, and that almost all of our energy needs to be focused on reforming the public procurement system. And our argument, and what we try to get to in this report, is that eliminates a huge number of actors who are very important to understand from the calculus. So we would absolutely agree that state capture, so many of the cases begin with an issue around public procurement and a board appointment that allowed a procurement process to be manipulated. But we can't understand really the problems alone as being that kind of public procurement angle, because there were private law firms and consultants that were constructing and approving the contracts. There were auditors at South African Airways who turned a blind eye for many years. If you look at what happened at SARS, you have one of the biggest management consultancies in the world meeting with the president of a country 18 times, apparently to co-construct what the damage and destruction that was going to happen there. And you're not going to fix those kind of problems by having a better open tender system. It's one part of the problem. And so, I mean, for the people who are making those comments, absolutely, there are definitely going to be gaps in the story, but we chose them also strategically to try and show that kind of range of actors. And so, for example, going back to PRASA, maybe a good example is the Swifambo contract is so important because ultimately that is a huge European, German-based rail company, Fossler, that decided to turn a blind eye and was happy to go ahead with the contract, even though courts since have said they should have known that this was fronting, that it was illegal in terms of South Africa's law. And of course, they now have thrown their hands up and say, oh, well, it's not our problem, it's corruption that's happening elsewhere. And if we leave those actors out of the analysis, I think we leave too big of a gap in our understanding of state capture more broadly.
Well, we completely ruled out the possibility that Bain was just advising the former president on whether to turn his swimming pool into a fire pool in a legitimate sense. I mean, that's not, I suppose we can always look into that. We can have another commission of inquiry into that, I suppose. But Risa, what I was going to ask is, there's a question from Hawken, which speaks specifically to what Michael was talking about. Is there any evidence that any Section 34 reports essentially alerting people to corruption were made under the Corruption Act around any of these cases? There were so many people right along the chain, and nobody seems to have flagged anything. Everyone said it's someone else's problem. We all looked the other way. I mean, the fact that this massive amount of money was stolen from so many institutions by so many people, and yet we don't have any of these Section 34 reports. I mean, isn't that staggering? It's a staggering absolution of responsibility completely right down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is, I think it kind of adds to what Michael has said, you know, Fossler had a duty to say this is wrong. If you look at the auditors like Nkonki and PwC, they had a duty to say, hey, there's something really weird going on with SAA's financial statements. We need to report the irregularities, and they completely turned a blind eye. And if they had reported those irregularities, SAA might not find itself in the predicament it's in now. You know, billions in public spending might not be spent on bailing SAA out instead of providing much needed water, electricity, housing, etc., the basic services that are required for communities to develop. So no, I mean, in none of our case studies did we find that anybody did report any of this kind of corruption. And one of the kind of recommendations that we've made throughout the report is actually in terms of PRECA, the Prevention of Corrupt Activities Act, the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. And one of the clauses of that act says, you know, that people need to report corrupt activities. And just by not doing that, you are committing a crime. And there were so many ways in which others, you know, in these networks could have said, hey, you didn't report this, you know, you're violating the law. And so, yeah, it's a very important point to make. And it's also, it kind of just goes to show that it's possible, you know, through these very simple turning blind eye acts, it's very possible to take action and hold people accountable.
Michael, that brings us to Urban and Psycho, which are the regulators for the accountants. I mean, you talked about PwC and Nkonki, the regulators who are meant to make sure that when the auditors don't do their jobs, they're held accountable. They also didn't do anything in this particular case.
No, I think there's a case to be made throughout the state capture years that those regulatory bodies have failed quite catastrophically. Psycho and Urba are important cases. Another one that we're increasingly looking at is whether the Legal Practice Council and before that, the law societies were acting on evidence against lawyers. And I think that in general, they've taken a soft touch approach, those bodies, to regulation kind of across the board. A couple of examples that I think are quite telling. One of the stories we tell in the report that has maybe become famous through the fat cake analogy that Yake Kunana gave to Judge Zondo, much to his kind of astonishment that a chartered accountant would be making this argument. But in that case, it's an interesting example because the fat cake contract, as she described it, was the Air Chefs, LSG, Sky Chefs debate within South African Airways. And what was so extraordinary, and this covers both the question of the regulatory bodies and the PRECA reporting requirements that the last question was about, is that South African Airways' own legal team sent the board and the audit committee a document that clearly said, this is illegal and we will be sued. Now, that is, first of all, an obvious red flag to the auditors. It's also, in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, it means that there's a violation of the PFMA, because any unlawful act that may harm the entity is such a violation. And you had the legal team internally saying it's illegal and we may face a lawsuit. And yet, after all of this came out of the commission, the Independent Regulatory Board for Auditors admitted, actually, that it had received a complaint about Yake Kwinana, and it had decided that there wasn't enough evidence for it to pursue a case. Now, if you look at the extent of the evidence that has come out, both in the media and at the commission over the last few years, it's just incredible to imagine that a regulatory body that had even taken a superficial look at what was happening at SAA and her capacity as both a CA and a registered auditor at that time, that they would look and say, well, nothing to see here, not even worthy of a further investigation. It's a massive problem. And one other interesting case that has come up in our investigation that has straddled a few of the different case studies, someone by the name of Rufilwe Mokoena. Now, Rufilwe Mokoena was a lawyer. She was at one point also an acting judge, and she comes up in multiple places. She was one of the board members appointed to the 2015 board at Denel by Lynn Brown, the infamous board that Zondo has concluded was almost entirely a project to capture the institution. And she was also an acting judge when she solicited money from Ace Magashule in the Free State, according to the Zondo Commission report, to send her daughter to school. Now, as far as we can tell, she remains a practicing attorney. And this is the kind of question, is that these people who are implicated across the board at state-owned enterprises, they continue to enjoy and practice their professions. They remain accountants, auditors, lawyers. And so they've so far failed to act. I think we've heard from organizations, SAICA, for one, have made some noise that they are going to act with greater haste. But I think we're yet to see the kind of energy, even since those statements have been made, to see them really forcefully holding their members to account and making moves that would actually reform the professions.
I think that's a critical point, but I also do think that what you raised there is that, you have people who are never held to account. And one of the questions we've had in this chat so far is that, it's deeply concerning when you see the same law firms and audit firms who have been implicated in this continuing to do work for the state. It's as if the one arm of the state has said, well, sure, we have to do this, but the rest of the state doesn't take it seriously. It's almost like cabinet doesn't feel itself accountable to the people. Surely not. I'm just being facetious, but I mean, that is ridiculous that you have zero consequence for this in some cases, specifically from the law firms and audit firms. Raisa, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a good time to mention that in its first report, the Zondo Commission said that there should be consideration of implementing debarments. And essentially, debarment means that private companies are no longer allowed to enter into government contracts for a certain period of time or indefinitely, depending on how serious the offense they committed is. So, this is also a recommendation that we agree with. It's something that we recommend in our reports. We're saying that auditors like PwC, consulting firms like Bain should not be allowed access to government contracts. And we have to remember that these auditors and these consultants make a lot of money in fees from government contracts. For example, auditors at PwC made up to 90 million in fees and were only fined 1 million rand for their work at SAA, which, when you think about it, is that really justice? It might be more just for them to be debarred from government contracts and to feel that as a source of justice, rather than a fine that essentially is very easily absorbed into their costs.
Michael, one of the senses that you get from reading the Zondo report is that nobody really feared the NPA. Nobody fears prosecution. Nobody lodges any reports about corruption, suspicious activities, because they just don't think that matters or that it's going to actually happen to them. The NPA is a huge link in this, and it's been one of the big problems. And I know you guys are looking at it for another report. Could you give us perhaps some texture on the NPA's ability to prosecute this? And now that we've got the final report, I don't know why the NPA sat around waiting for it, but what are the odds that they'll actually be able to do anything with it?
Robert, I mean, just to say, it was very disturbing. As you say, there was at least one announcement and headlines that kind of suggested that the MPA was like, great, now we can act. Whereas we know the Zondo Commission has been sharing everything it has, or should have been sharing everything it has with law enforcement for a very long period of time. I mean, to be completely frank, our take from Open Secrets is a mixture of hope and trepidation, in the sense that we agree there have to be prosecutions. It's just so difficult to imagine how we break the chain of impunity and prevent the recurrence from these types of crimes and actions without actually holding people accountable criminally and withdrawing them from those networks. You know, I think PRASA is a great example of this, is that there's just no sense that anything is changing within that institution. And part of the reason surely is that, as you say, people look at the MPA and the Hawks and they say, you know, what are the chances that we are actually going to be held to account for this? I think that at the same time, we are very worried about the capacity within these institutions to take on this type of work, and also their ability to act without fear or favor and to do so independently. It's one of the reasons that, and we come back to this issue of what we've called the low-hanging fruits. And I think the person who asked the question earlier, for example, about, you know, the failure to report in terms of PRECA is a good example. And it takes us back to why we wrote the report, is that no doubt, the MPA has moved, for example, on Eric Wood, Siyabonga Khama, others in relation to Transnet. You know, hopefully the arrests will follow in terms of ESCOM, people like Brian Molefe, Anuj Singh, others who are at the center of these massive conspiracies, right, to extract money from those entities. But those are going to be massively complicated and drawn out prosecutions. They have to proceed, but they will inevitably take an extraordinary amount of time. And that's why we're really making the case again to law enforcement and the MPA here, is to say, while you are building those cases, you have to also build capacity to take on the smaller cases and start showing people at every rung of the ladder, the people who often fly under the radar, that they will be held to account. And so let's prosecute directors who are clearly flagrantly in violation of the Public Finance Management Act. Let's prosecute a handful of people who we can show with absolute clarity failed to report corruption in terms of PRECA when they should have. If there are any auditors who clearly can be shown to have violated the Audit Profession Act, for example. And we're saying to the MPA very clearly here, you don't have to prosecute absolutely every case in terms of the grand conspiracy racketeering case. There's certainly the space for those to happen, and they have to happen in terms of state capture. But there has to also be value in terms of some of those lower hanging fruit and simple cases. And maybe the final thing I would just add in response to this is one of the gaps from our perspective, from law enforcement, appears to be is that if you don't start prosecuting people, how are you going to successfully turn people into state witnesses? And that's what I think we haven't seen in this regard, is that once you get some successful prosecutions under your belt, you can start extracting guilty pleas, for example, and you can start to build other cases with the help of state witnesses and other people that you can extract. And so, in a sense, we're saying to the MPA, you have to be able to do this. Start small in many cases and hope that builds some of the momentum.
I think that's an important point about prosecutorial strategy, and I think that's getting people to roll up the ladder is important, turn state witness against people higher in the chain. But ultimately, a critic might say that you don't just want to perpetually prosecute the foot soldiers, you want the masterminds in jail, ultimately. And that is what you still want. I mean, and it's going to be very difficult, like you said, to prove a big conspiracy like this. Do you think?
So I think there will. I mean, I think that from our perspective, those battles have to be carried out in parallel. And so one of the significant battles that we have publicly expressed concern about is how the MPA has been handling the extradition of the two Gupta brothers from the UAE, because that is going to be of fundamental importance. The MPA now has a limited amount of time to decide what else it wants to charge those Gupta brothers with before it successfully secures their extradition, if they do. And those kind of things are going to be crucial if we're going to have that kind of successful prosecution of the prominent individuals who were ultimately the ultimate beneficiaries of these types of cases. And the same would go for the large corporates that enabled the money and others to be extracted offshore for Gupta benefit. I think that the other part of the question, which is something that maybe Raisa could speak to better than I could, because she's been working on this more closely, but it's the NPA has, as I've said, a system and resourcing problem. It needs to build expertise and build units that can act on these cases. But it also needs to acknowledge that it is, by all accounts, filled with prosecutors who are at loggerheads with their own senior management and who there is evidence against have interfered with state capture related cases. And I don't think we can any longer continue talking about the NPA by pretending that those problems don't exist, because they do. And the NPA very often vacillates itself between saying there's no crisis, but also we have all these problems. And I don't think they're also being fully transparent with South Africans about the state internally at the prosecuting authority.
I suppose it's difficult to say that we're a mess if you still want to go to court and put people in jail. It's a difficult thing to admit to. Raisa, I was going to ask, there's a question from Paul talking about that exact issue. You know, if we led from the bottom and we build up and we never actually get to the architects of state capture and those guys don't go to prison ultimately, if it fails somewhere along the way, does that mean that this process has been a failure, or is it good enough to get the foot soldiers?
I don't think it's a failure, because I think ultimately if we take action against even the foot soldiers, it will send some course of accountability through communities and through these networks that might say, hey, you know, maybe I shouldn't do this. But ultimately, I do agree that we need to eventually start working our way to the top and to get to the masterminds. At the moment, as Mike has said, I don't think that the NPA and the Hawks have the capacity to do a full-on racketeering investigation. It won't work with the resources they have at the moment. They don't have the financial expertise within the prosecuting authority or within the Hawks, and they don't have the numbers of people that they need to do these investigations. So ultimately, at this point, I don't think that they're ready. But the one thing that I would want to ask is just to say that, you know, the NPA at some point need to say what they've done in terms of this task team that they've created to deal with state capture cases. They promised in January that they would create a task team. This comes after the ID was also established in 2018 with the purpose of dealing with state capture crime. So now we have an ID, we have a task team, but we don't seem to be building the momentum we should to prosecute these cases. And like Mike has said, you know, I think it's also time for the NPA and the Hawks to be transparent. They've been transparent insofar as they've spoken about the resources that they don't have, but they haven't always been transparent about what they're doing inside these agencies to fix them. And that's what we really need to know. And I think in order to prosecute the leaders, the masterminds, these agencies need to fix themselves. They need to root out officials who may have been accused of misconduct or who've made decisions that have delayed prosecuting cases. They need to think about what they can do to find the financial skills that they need to prosecute these cases. And that's the only way that we're going to start being able to get to the top.
Lisa, just to stay with you for a second, there's a question from Kate that I think speaks to one of the arms of the law enforcement authorities that really can ensure some form of accountability, which is the asset forfeiture unit, because this can freeze the actual assets, take the assets back. What is the likelihood of the AFU proceeding in a fairly timely manner in the absence of the NPA proceeding, I suppose? I mean, do they have the resources to expedite the process?
At the moment, no. The AFU is also experiencing a shortage of staff members. So I don't think that they're fully resourced as yet. The one thing is that if they do manage to recover what they've lost in these years through, for example, Sean Abrams and Kobojiba, then eventually we should be able to get ourselves to a point where we can recover assets. At the moment, we can, you know, there have been assets frozen, there have been preservation orders. We know this particularly in the Optimum Mine case, but there is definitely more that the AFU can do. And it's just about sort of recovering these units of the NPA that were also quite deeply affected in the capture years by the conduct of some of the NDPPs who were making decisions at that time.
There's a question, Michael, as well. What do you, if you report crimes committed by state officials, including the NPA, to Shamila Batoy, the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and she fails to act, what do you do then? I mean, what is your, I suppose, mode of accountability then?
So it's a very good question. And it's a question that we have increasingly been grappling with at Open Secrets, and something that I think it's maybe an appropriate time to remind ourselves that Parliament exists. And one of the things I think in South Africa we have become very jaded about.
Is it really? The Zondo report was fairly ambivalent about that.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I think, you know, that's the point, is that we've become so jaded and disappointed with Parliament's apparent complete lack of interest in doing its job to hold these kinds of institutions to account. But we can't give up on it, because ultimately that is the route. You know, the parliamentary committees should be much harder on the SOEs. They should also be much harder on the MPA and the Hawks to explain to them in you know, often excruciating detail why they're not moving forward on these cases. And I think we've got to broadly start to put much more pressure back onto Parliament in various ways to be able to fulfill that function. Because if we don't, and this is maybe another area where I think that the Zondo Commission starts to drift a little bit, is that we will be caught up in this endless discussion about creating new institutions to do things, to plug the gap, because we see an absence of accountability. And so we keep creating new institutions to do specific tasks. But ultimately, the way our democracy is set up is they will all still have to answer to Parliament. And if that is their route to accountability and we can't fix that parliamentary system, I think that we'll continue to be in very deep trouble. And just to say, on top of that, I mean, we're very clear that this report that we've released today, and it is now available online for anyone to download, you know, we're going to be giving that to every parliamentary committee that we believe needs to receive it. And we're going to ask them to call the relevant entities and to use it as a basis and as a resource, hopefully, in a neatly packaged way, to ask the kind of questions to the people that appear before the committees, the questions that they need to be asked.
You said there's a comment from what looks like Angelo Grisi, who says that he's speaking about the Basasa corruption. The potential exists for whistleblowers, I suppose, to themselves be targeted and come out of this pretty badly, whereas the rest can walk free. You expose yourself as a whistleblower, as has happened in many cases. And the guys actually you are reporting on and who are actually perpetrators end up walking free. What is this report, and what is the implications of that for, I suppose, justice in the end?
Yeah, so I think there's a really good point that's been made there about whistleblowers and their importance. We've included a chapter in our report on whistleblowers. We specifically looked at whistleblowers in terms of PRASA, because at PRASA, there have been 3 whistleblowers in particular who have been very outspoken about corruption at the agency, and they have been harassed, they have been victimized, they have been threatened. And this was under Lucky Montana's leadership as CEO. Later, under the current board, there are also allegations that this victimization has continued. So, you know, we saw kind of an instance under Montana where they were victimized. Then Popo Molefe came in and things seemed to be getting better. But now a new board was appointed and that victimization seems to be repeating itself. So definitely, we don't believe that the Public Disclosures Act is doing its job at the moment to protect whistleblowers. And certainly we need better protection for whistleblowers. The PRASA instance is just one example of how whistleblowers are treated in South Africa. But we can't forget that there are whistleblowers across the board in various different situations that suffer victimization. So I think that is a really important point, and something that the Zondo Commission has also highlighted. The story of state capture would not be possible without whistleblowers, and they should be given due credit for the work that they've done and the risks that they've taken.
But like you say, you know, for the risks that they've taken, they want to see accountability actually happen. So that's ultimately why it's important that the NPA can actually do that and the AFU can actually do that. So I suppose that's needs to happen. Guys, please post some questions. We've answered a few of them, as many as we can, and we'll get to more of them. But Michael, I know that there's a topic that you love to speak about, which is the notion raised by a couple of people in the Cape and around that, you know, the perpetrators of state capture should be offered amnesty in a way. I suppose it's it's a very heated issue, and it's contentious, and I think it might have some sort of resonance with the TRC. You give people amnesty for coming forward and admitting their crimes, but it's a different process. And I suppose it'd be great to just discuss your thoughts on that particular proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. It was another kind of serendipitous moment that we released this report, not just as Zondo drops its final report, but also, we release a report almost entirely dedicated to pursuing criminal and other accountability at the same time that the amnesty debate comes back up. And so it is an important one to deal with. Look, I think that there are a couple of aspects of it that we at Open Secrets find, I guess, a little bit confusing from the argument point of view. And the big one actually flows directly out of the discussion that we've been having in this webinar, is that if we don't rebuild an NPA and a Hawks that's capable of really undertaking successful criminal prosecutions, what incentive would any person implicated in state capture have for applying for amnesty? And this is something that those proposing amnesty admit, is that it doesn't work, because you've got to have a successful stick if the carrot of amnesty would work. And yet then if we do have an MPA that's capable of taking on the cases, the next question then becomes, well, then why wouldn't you pursue the prosecution? Because accountability seems so key to break up some of those networks. And so then the second case, or the second argument for amnesty, appears to then be based on issues of, well, they'd help us understand everything. But that takes us back to one of the first things we said, is that, are there lots of cases that we really need a huge amount more information to understand what happened? There may be one or two, but I really struggle to see it. Our point is that in many of the instances, we know what happened, and there are many, competent legal professionals who are saying, we think there's sufficient evidence. The Zondo Commission says there's sufficient evidence, so let's proceed. And so, I think that there remain complicated questions around how to do plea deals, for example, and how the MPA wants to set up policies to deal, for example, with corporations and prosecutions. But I must say that we remain very skeptical about a broader discussion about state capture amnesty. And maybe just a final thought on this, because it is relevant to the MPA, is that when we look back at the amnesty that was linked, part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, although we're talking about very different crimes in that regard, the reason that arguably it failed so catastrophically was exactly because the MPA refused to prosecute the cases they were told to prosecute when amnesty was denied. Hundreds of them were given to the prosecuting authority, and they declined to proceed, purportedly because they were subject to political interference that stopped them proceeding. And that devalues the whole process. So, I mean, and maybe that's something that's quite positive, is that whether you are in support of an amnesty for state capture or not, everyone seems to agree that an MPA that's capable of undertaking prosecutions is a must. And so at the very least, we can agree that that has to be done as a first port of call.
Marisa, your thoughts on that? I mean, so essentially not doing it, when Michael says he finds the proposal confusing, that's Open Secrets talk for hell no. But I mean, essentially, is that an admission of defeat? If you call for an amnesty, you're saying, well, we don't believe the NPA can do it, so let's just throw an amnesty in there. I mean, there's so many other cases besides the TRC where the NPA have been told to act and they haven't acted. Would it just be saying that we can't do the job, so this is the best we can do?
Yeah, and I mean, there have been other kind of non-trial resolutions that have been put forward. So, for example, at some point, the NPA was saying, they're seriously considering doing DPAs, deferred prosecution agreements, which also kind of sees people kind of making a deal to not be prosecuted, maybe paying a fine, maybe hopefully there would be an admission of guilt. But ultimately, yeah, I think that we need to kind of focus on building an NPA that can prosecute. Our first port of call should not be to, kind of go into DPAs or to enter into amnesty deals. It should be to say, hey, this is the law and you broke it. And, you deserve to be facing justice for that. So my hope is that the conversation would move away from amnesty or DPAs and to instead centering itself on creating a prosecuting authority that can effectively prosecute people who are implicated in state capture and other financial crimes.
I mean, certainly there's scope for the NPA to convince some private high-end prosecutors to join them for this particular project, right? I mean, they do have that option.
Yes, they do. I think it's yeah. We need to, I think, consider various kind of aspects about why the NPA might not be so keen or might be so keen on the idea. At the moment, I think one of the very important considerations is that the costs of getting outside counsel at, particularly senior counsel could be quite exorbitant. And the NPA might not always be able to afford those costs. So in the next few years, there have been projected budgets that see funding to the NPA starting to decline. So that could be of one concern. Ultimately, I also think that we also, in terms of this rebuilding of the NPA, we need to get it at a point where it's not hiring outside counsel to consult on cases and to work part-time. We need these prosecutors to be inside the NPA all the time as a full-time job. And this is the hope. Once upon a time, before we had our Sean Abrams or our Jibbers, there were very capable prosecutors inside the NPA. Andrea Johnson, when she became head of the ID, she herself spoke about the fact that so many prosecutors were moved around, that it was a terrible environment to be in. And we need to create an NPA that ultimately is gone back to being the agency that prosecutors want to work at, instead of going into private law.
And feared, I suppose, as well. Michael, there's an interesting question from Haroon, which is that in the final analysis, will the next chapter of Zondo, essentially the prosecutions, not be determined by whether President Cyril Ramaphosa is elected for another term as president and is around, now that we know that game farming enthusiast Arthur Fraser has lobbed his grenades into the middle of the fray?
So I think that, there's a cold political reality, I suppose, and then there's the question of protection of the institutions. But I do think that it is so problematic that we've increasingly viewed how institutions will be able to conduct themselves almost entirely through the lens of the ANC's internal factional battles. And there is no doubt that there is a very vehement fight back campaign, if you want to call it that, that's happening right now, that is backed by those who are deeply implicated in state capture. And they're doing so because they want to avoid accountability. But I think that we need to take that on board, and we need to reject those arguments and where they come from those people and their vested interests, while at the same time saying that what is most crucial of all is that Shamla Batohi, as the NDPP, decides who to prosecute, and she should not be listening to anyone. Of course, the question is that as the political principle, the NPA requires at least the protection of not being interfered with. And that is absolutely crucial. And is there a future where political actors do try and do that? I think it's entirely possible. That is the question. But ultimately, we should judge the prosecuting authority on its own decisions, and we need to build it, and we need to build the structures so that it can do so without that outside influence.
Well, I suppose this entire ordeal illustrates how quickly so-called independent institutions can be unraveled. This was in the space of a couple of years that capacity that now needs to be rebuilt was completely denuded. And I think that the speed of it is what was quite alarming when you look at the final Zondo report, is how successful it was and how rapid it was. And we're living with the consequence now. I think that, guys, just to not to take up your entire evening, to get back to the darkness that we will have awaiting us, Reese, I think if perhaps you could just give a final two thoughts on what we talked about and your report, and ultimately why it's important.
Yes, so just to reiterate for anybody who hasn't been able to read the report yet, that it's available on the website, and that we'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on our social media channels, so please feel free to reach out. I think my final thoughts are really just that, again, it's not hopeless. This report is about finding ways in which we can hold people accountable. It's been a very long time of waiting, and people have protested, people have done so many different things to be heard. And now that the Zondo Commission has ended, there's really no excuse for law enforcement agencies to say that we can't act. And it's time for us to say, well, you said you would, so it's time you do. And added to that, these case studies also show, like we kind of explained, the low-hanging fruit, the cases that can be acted upon by professional bodies and law enforcement agencies. And it's important to remember that it can be done. It's not impossible. It doesn't have to be a massive racketeering case. It can be a PRECA violation or, a smaller PFMA, a fraud violation, for example, those all matter and those do yield results as well.
And Michael, your thoughts on that? I mean, essentially, what Teresa said is that there's hope, and currently we've had 10 years of stage 6 state capture load shedding, and we can go back down to stage 2. Or dare we suggest stage 0?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Raisa very strongly, and I think that the sense is that we can't abandon all hope in the institutions, because where do you go to from there? And I think that's also important to say here, is that we're obviously very strident in our criticism of the MPA and the Hawks and the others who need to do their jobs, because it's so crucial to the country that they do them. But also we do from the position of inherent belief that they are capable ultimately of being able to do that, and we are here to push them along and to assist. And that's why we write these reports. We are turning them also into legal cases that we hand over to law enforcement to assist them to build on those cases, and that it is indeed possible. I mean, I think maybe just the last thing that I would say is that we do lurch from crisis to crisis in South Africa, but I think many things that appear impossible from one moment to the next suddenly do become possible. And I don't think, for example, that a few years ago in the heart of capture, we could have had the imagination of a 5,500 word forensic unpicking of everyone implicated, well, many of the people implicated in state capture, with recommendations for prosecutions and new leadership in many institutions who are trying to rebuild. And so I think we have to imagine those possibilities going forward. And this is hopefully, it's Open Secrets, one of our small contributions to that.
Eloquently put. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. There'll be a recording of this available. Please get the Financial Mail this week and read Natasha Marion's cover story on the Zondo Commission and Open Secrets contribution to this particular debate, and let us know what you think. And we'll be back soon with more webinars with Open Secrets. And the message here is that there is light ahead, even though sometimes it's hard to see in stage 6 load shedding, but there will be light. Thank you very much for your time.